Welcome to the Three Padres and a Shepherd podcast, where three North Dakota Lutheran pastors and a real-life shepherd combine serious theology with fun laughter. This is a podcast from the local church and for the local church. However, the local churches of these three pastors do not take any responsibility for the banter, foolery, and assertions that will follow. Welcome to the Three Padres and a Shepherd podcast.
Welcome to the Three Padres and a Shepherd podcast. In today's episode, we are talking about syncretism, sectarianism, and the problem of modern-day monasteries. So stick around for this month's episode of Three Padres and a Shepherd. How's it going, guys?
Very good. How about yourself?
We're good. I mean, we had a little technological difficulties here, but I think we're good. Take two, right? Yeah, so we'll have to redo our same jokes that we had. They were pretty stellar last time along. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Man.
It's a shame no one's going to hear them because they were just that amazing. And
They were amazing. Yeah.
they were too pure for this world.
Yeah.
Do you remember the Tenacious D song, the greatest song they ever wrote, and they couldn't remember it? And this isn't anything like that, but the last episode was really good.
It was really good.
It would have been great.
Would have been great.
This one won't be anything like that one.
Yeah, we would have had thousands of downloads on the previous one.
Yeah.
Hey, so what's new? Give me an update. What's new? You already told me what's new about 10 minutes ago, but let's hear it again.
Butchered some lambs on Saturday, I guess. That was interesting and exciting. So, gone full circle.
Yeah, first episode you were birthing lambs. Now you're eating them.
Now we're killing them. Yeah.
Killing them. There you go.
Shoot. Poor
He's the
guys.
circle of life. He's a very Lion King over at your place.
Yeah. Very Lion King. Yeah.
Very Lion King-ish.
There's a new Lion King movie coming out, I see.
Is there?
Oh,
yeah.
there?
Yeah.
It's on Mufasa
Yep.
Oh, boy.
Prequel.
prequel. Mm-hmm.
I will not be watching that. I can guarantee it.
I probably will at some point. So.
So, Brad, what's new with you? Anything new with you?
Got some car troubles. Finally got my bees all put inside the pole building for the winter. You know, I decided to wait till winter to do it because that's how my life goes sometimes. And otherwise, it's just been business as usual. Nice now. The calves are out in the feedlot. I don't have to feed them anymore, which is great.
Nice. Neuendorf, what's new?
What's new is we had a quiet Thanksgiving at home because we're too far from family to travel and see anyone. And a few weeks ago, I got to watch Die Hard again, first time in years. Beautiful movie.
Beautiful movie.
Is it a Christmas movie?
I'm not going to answer that this time.
It's a Christmas movie.
Neuendorf says no, and he's wrong. That's what we came up with last time, right?
It just doesn't have the character of a Christmas movie.
Sure.
What
it
is the
does.
character of a Christmas movie?
Makes
got
you
a
feel
happy-
warm and fuzzy. Oh, wait a minute.
It's a happy ending.
Maybe it is a Christmas movie. Okay, one thing I got to say about it that we didn't say last time. When my dad showed me Die Hard when I was a child, it was after he had shown me a whole series of Chuck Norris movies. I think Red Dawn may have been one of the last movies he'd shown me, which is a great movie, but it's dark. I mean, it was kind of traumatizing for me as a 10, 11-year-old. But then he showed me Predator, and that cheered me right up. And then after that, he showed me Die Hard. And I thought, in contrast to all those other kind of darker, more serious action movies, Die Hard was the word I used to express it was joyous or joyful.
Yeah.
And
Christmas
really,
movie.
what really got me thinking that was when they break into the vault and they play "Ode to Joy," which, by the way, we should feature in this podcast at some point. You could get a public domain recording of "Ode to Joy."
I'm sure we could. Yeah.
So, and that kind of makes it a Christmas movie. But I told my dad, boy, that movie felt joyful. That's what I said as like a 12-year-old. And he said, "Boy, I hope not. A lot of people died. A lot of violence. And I mean, we like movies with a lot of people dying, a lot of violence, and so on. But that's not joyful." Well, I read up on Wikipedia about Die Hard, and it turns out John McTiernan the director, intended it to be joyful. And I think he succeeded. He's the greatest action director, I believe. Predator and Die Hard. And oh my goodness, The Hunt for Red October,
So what we're hearing
13th
is
Warrior.
Hunt for October, Predator, and Die Hard are all Christmas movies. That's what,
Predator
right?
is not a Christmas movie.
Okay, all right.
I think Predator is more of a Thanksgiving movie.
Oh, because of all of the butchering.
Because of all of the butchering.
Oh no.
Well, for next month's episode, when we have to do our intro for our main event music, I'll have to have that different song
Ode
go
to
on
Joy.
there. Yeah, Ode to Joy, right? Meanwhile, we're stuck with this one.
Chef's kiss on that transition, Richard.
Oh man, smooth, huh?
Yeah.
We might actually be getting good at this, huh?
No.
No. Okay.
Bradamar,
Don't lie to the people.
are you back to your Panasonic headphones or whatever they are, Sony's? Or didn't you go
Radio
away from
Shack.
those? Radio
Thank you.
Shack.
The Radio
No,
Shack,
I lost my earbuds. I don't know where they are. My kids ran off with them.
We're back to the Radio Shack.
We're back to these are the only headphones they won't touch, which is why they're the ones I always use.
And they keep on working and working and working. Nice. Okay, so we were talking about before we went on the air as far as this topic. We have some really, really hefty words here, and so it would probably be good for us to define some of these terms as we unpack this. So, kind of what we're wrestling with is just kind of the role of the Christian, as far as the Christian or the church, as far as a relationship to the world and each other. Are we in the world? Are we of the world? Kind of how does all that work? Doctrinally, how do we relate to the world, and also vocationally and so forth. But to kind of flesh this out, let's just maybe define some terms as briefly as we can. So when we say the word sectarian, we had a little bit of a difference in understanding of that term, namely from a lot of it was from my background as far as theological background coming into Missouri Synod. So let's just make sure we get the term set correctly. Sectarianism, what do we mean by that? Nudorf, take us away on that definition.
Well, it's just occurring to me this is a rare opportunity to combine etymology and entomology.
Oh boy.
Because think about the word insect. You usually define an insect as a bug with 6 legs, but what actually makes it an insect is that it has a head, a thorax, and an abdomen that are different sections. It's cut into 3 parts. So sect, it comes from Latin for cutting. So the sect is like a section of the church. It's a part that's been snipped off from the rest of the church. That's quite some. I'm sorry, guys. I didn't intend any of this to be giggle-inducing or anything, but
Neuendorf, I have this vision of you now, like taking like ants and like pulling them apart and saying, "Look, Mom, I'm making sects." Yeah.
Well, converting them, I suppose, right?
You dissect. You dissect an ant and pull its little intestines out and so on.
Hey, Bo, you just dissected. You sected up some sheep
I
there.
sected some sheep. Yeah, sected them.
Yeah.
We sected the heck out of them.
So, when you're talking about the Christian church, the sect is that tiny part of Christendom that's been cut off from the rest. So you become a sect when you define yourself by some strange set of doctrines that the rest of the church doesn't hold. So you consider the whole church to be the Church Catholic, which of course doesn't mean the Roman Catholic Church. It means the church according to its wholeness, the broader holy Christian church on earth. But the sect defines itself over against the rest of the church. So the Lutheran Church has often defined itself over against the sects, those small church bodies that all have their own unique, strange beliefs that don't have historical precedent. So that's the typical way that the word sect is used in the Lutheran Church. And then sectarianism would be commitment to the unique, aberrant doctrines that define these sects as such.
So are sects automatically heretical?
I think so. Because there is heresy has to do with self-chosen worship or belief. So it is by adopting your own self-chosen beliefs that you constitute yourself a sect and cut yourself off from the rest of Christendom.
Can we pause? Just I had this conversation at St. Paul's on is it on Sunday or is it a women's Bible study, trying to talk about the definitions between a heretic and heterodox. I mean, we hear these words quite a
Right.
bit. So just real briefly, can we define that? So a heretic, I mean, we often throw that term around and like, oh no, he's a heretic, right? We throw that around. I once heard it said that most people are not smart enough to be heretics. So how would we what's the difference between a heretic and somebody who's heterodox?
I want to say that technically heresy cuts you off from Christ.
Okay.
It is an error of such magnitude that it strikes at the heart of the Christian faith, and you cannot be saved. So, Arianism is kind of the ultimate, the heresy par excellence. In Arianism, you believe that the Son of God is not actually God; he's a separate created being. And of course, if a separate created being died for your sins, you're still lost and damned. To be a Christian, you have to believe that God died for your sins, that Jesus is God, and worship him as God. So most heresies strike at the divinity of Christ in one way or another. Sect or sectarianism can also have a secondary meaning that would be synonymous with what we call parochialism. So maybe you've heard of parochial education. Parochialism means you're focused on your own internal community to the exclusion of the outward community. So, for instance, the Lutheran day school used to be, in its original conception, intended for the children of the congregation. It was to be cut off from the rest of the world. So that our kids receive a Lutheran education, they grow up with a Lutheran ethos. Well, over the decades, particularly as we don't have enough kids to fill a Lutheran day school anymore, those Lutheran day schools have shifted from being parochial to being an outreach. So you bring kids from the community into your school, and they are exposed then to the Word of God, to the gospel. But there are trade-offs there, because when you bring the kids from the world, you're also bringing a certain worldliness with them, and you always have to be on your guard over that. But I think what Matt is getting at here with sectarianism is that secondary way of looking at it. The church viewing itself as kind of cut off from the world, trying to maintain its own Christian bunker, so to speak.
Okay, so let's flesh that out a little bit. I mean, you know, we hear a lot in American Christianity this idea of the Great Commission, and that Great Commission is, you know, go therefore, make disciples. And there's always that. At least my background growing up as a child and a young man in a previous denomination, it was always in the banners and the mission statements, and it was always printed everywhere that we had to kick everybody out, get out, don't be kind of that secondary use, sectarian. Don't be don't bring up the drawbridge. Don't put up the big walls. You know, break down the walls, open the doors, and get on out. So how do we? Is there a balance to this, or are there just two different categories in which we think of this? Do we just let the walls down and have no standards, or do we have the walls up high? How would we flush that out?
Well, when it comes to missions, if you're going to go out and tell people about Jesus, you probably should know who he is and what he actually said and what he actually did. Because if you are going out and talking to people about Christ but are ignorant of these things, you're not going to do much good, right? So the way we handle this is that we keep our doctrine and our practice free from the taint of the world, right? We maintain that Catholicity. We don't go off and do some weird little thing that's all unique on our own. Because if we don't do that, then our members of our churches will not know who Jesus really is or what he's really done. And therefore, we'll have nothing useful to say to those people outside of the church about the Savior who is Jesus Christ.
Good. Yeah, that's great. Okay, so maybe let's just push this conversation a little further then. Okay, so then as far as going out, let's just say per se, going out, mingling with the world, do we have concerns there? As far as like as far as Christians, you know what I mean? To what degree do we mingle? Let's just say mingle with the world.
Wasn't there that old saying, right? We're in the world, but not of the world. I mean, we have to be involved in the world because your neighbor's out there. You have to go talk to him. We can't, go build a compound in North Dakota. We can't go up by Cooperstown. I just saw this. There was an auction sale up there some time ago. They sold a missile silo, and you could buy it and turn it into your dream compound. Wouldn't that be wonderful? And then you could cut yourself off from the world and be self-sufficient, and then there would be no sin in your life, right?
Well, you're saying that as if it's a given, and that is the least preferable thing. But is that a given that you just can't do that? I mean, why is that so self-evident to you?
Well, you can't serve your neighbor if you never see him.
But why can't I serve the people that are immediately with me if I have myself, my family, and a group of fellow Christians in that compound?
Because your neighbor isn't just the people in your family and just the people in your church.
Okay.
So that you said a phrase there, Radamar. We're in the world, but not of the world. I heard it said once upon a time. We're in the world, but we're not of the world, but we're for the world. It's very catchy. Is there anything problematic with that? How would anything problematic? Any concerns? That idea in the world, not of the world, but for the world. It's nice and neat. It makes sense. But is there any concern on that?
I don't know how this addresses your concern, but I feel compelled to draw attention to 1 Corinthians 5, starting at verse 9. So in 1 Corinthians 5, St. Paul is warning the Corinthian congregation, you've got this guy who has a sexual relationship with his stepmom, and even the pagans recognize that's gross. So you got to deal with this. Don't claim that your Christian faith makes it okay that he's doing this. You got to excommunicate him. But then he says in verse 9, I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with fornicators, that is, those who are having sex outside of marriage. Not at all, meaning the fornicators of this world, or the greedy and swindlers or idolaters, since then you would need to go out of the world. But now I'm writing to you not to associate with anyone who bears the name of brother, that is, anyone who claims to be a Christian, if he is guilty of fornication or greed or is an idolater, reviler, drunkard, or swindler, not even to eat with such a one. So for Paul, you are in the world and actually associating with people engaged in all manner of sins, but you don't participate in their sins. And you make it clear, because you bear the name of brother, because you're a Christian, a believer in Jesus Christ, you're not engaging in these behaviors. And you make it clear, anyone who is engaging in these behaviors is not part of your fellowship, is not part of your brotherhood. So in the world, in the sense that we associate with all manner of sinners, not of the world in the sense that we refrain from the sinful activities of our society, and we gatekeep. We make sure that folks in our congregations, in our fellowship, are not engaging in these worldly behaviors.
Speaking of gatekeeping, one of the things that I think drives me crazy about church membership is we've reduced the idea for an adult convert, let's say, becoming a Christian to, hey, take a 2-week class or a 4-week class or a 6-week class, whatever it is. You get, a certain number of hours of contact time with the pastor via classroom instruction, and then you're good to go in the church. And I don't think that that's sufficiently responsible to actually make sure that our members are in, but not of the world, because you don't actually even know what the person confesses, right? They just go to a class. I think catechesis should be more comprehensive than that, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
I have never had the luxury of having a class with students. It's always been one-on-one adult instruction, because I never have enough who are interested at one time whose schedules can all coordinate to have a larger class, which means I have opportunity in all of my instruction, particularly with the 10 Commandments, to talk through what God actually commands over against what our world practices and teaches, which I think gives sufficient opportunity to make sure that the folks who are coming into the church know what's right and what's wrong, what is expected of a Christian brother.
To be really crass about this, I think we do need to take seriously that for adults coming into the church, they need to be deprogrammed before we can bring them into Christ's church. I mean, they got all this baggage, and we have to point out that there's a difference, because there is still this idea that lurks around that general American society and Christianity are more or less the same thing. And we need to disabuse people of that, because they're not directly the same thing. They may have some overlap, but they're not identical.
I think that's a point worth making. I would want to make sure that we don't expect the completion of the process as a condition of membership,
Right.
because the whole rest of your life is going to be a process of deprogramming, opening your eyes to that which Satan has blinded you from.
I guess to put it even more crassly, I like people to know what they're getting themselves into, you know?
So as far as like, this idea of judgment or criteria or I don't know how else we would say it, just basically judgment or criteria or holding to account, would we say that we hold a higher standard to inside the church than those outside of the church, using that distinction then?
Yes. In fact, Paul doesn't really have a standard for those outside the church. He says, what have I to do with judging outsiders? It's not our job to
Yep.
judge people outside the church.
So basically, when people say you can't judge me, only God can judge me, first of all, that's problematic. I mean, I'd rather be judged by, human court any day than God himself, because God can see the intentions of the heart, whereas a human court trial, they can only see the outward actions and so forth. Okay, so it's problematic to begin with, but this idea of like, you can't judge me, within the church, that's to be expected, judgment upon our thoughts, words, and deeds as Christians from inside the church. So if you have a judgmental church, that's kind of biblical, would we say?
Well, judgmental in the sense that we take seriously each other's behaviors.
Yeah.
Not judgmental, I would hope, in the sense that we look down our noses at those who aren't as progressed in the way of holiness as we are. We
Which is usually a sign you're not as progressed in holiness as you think you are.
right, exactly.
Okay, so Bo and I, we got to remember that, Bo,
Mhm.
from now on. Okay.
What, that you're not sanctified, but Bo is? Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah.
So you got the person on the streets that says you can't judge me, only God can judge me. It's if your proper evangelism would be just saying to them the things that Christ has said, just the gospel in the full sense, God's law and God's. I mean, is it the duty of Christians? Are we even in proper evangelism even judging those who are outside of the church if we're just saying to them what Christ commanded us to say, or just repeating His words? Or are we, through that good theology, through the law and the gospel, just saying to them what Christ has said in His word? And then they're judging themselves and finding, oh crap, I don't measure up.
I guess I'd say Paul's goal in 1 Corinthians 5 is not to transform society. He's not trying to make the Roman Empire into a beautiful, just society where everybody's living wonderful lives. He's operating, leading a church within a society that is perishing. And his goal is not to reform you as you exist in society, but to rescue you from that society.
To sect you out of it.
Yeah. To draw you into the parochial life of the church.
Mm-hmm.
So that might be a good segue, as far as talking about monasteries, and that's kind of what we're aiming at. And this is coming from some conversation that we had at St. Paul's Lutheran Church as far as the modern day monasteries, but that using Bo's language there to sect you out of culture. As far as monasteries, historically speaking, there's a sense of what, pulling away from the culture. Would that be how do we define that? A monastery, maybe in a simple way, but then also historically, what were monasteries and what were their goals of monasteries? What were the goals of the monasteries?
I think Brademeyer has read probably more than I have on early monasticism.
Have I actually read more than you on anything?
Oh yeah,
I don't know if that's true.
psychology.
Oh, all the weird stuff, huh? Well, okay, I'm trying to remember my proper terms here, and so I'm going to invent new ones because I can't remember the right ones. But you have kind of two things that you see early on in early Christian monasticism. One is you have hermits that go off to try to be by themselves for a life of contemplation and prayer. Some of the extreme ones go so far as to even eschew, avoid getting together with their congregations to receive the word and the sacraments. And then this is held up as some kind of spiritually mature thing, which is, of course, very problematic because we're all dependent on the word and the sacraments where God gives us his grace. And then the second form is communal monasticism. And there's kind of two subtypes to that you can kind of tease out of it. One is sort of, it's okay. We Lutherans have problems with monasteries, right? We don't like monks. We tend to be pretty negative about them. But I think there is a form of monastic life that's not inherently anti-Lutheran. Because let's say all four of us were single guys and we were lonely and it stunk to live alone. And we decided that we would rather be roommates and pray together every morning. And we'd go do what we had to do that day and then come back home and pray together that night. And we, shared we bought food for each other and lived in common. That's technically monasticism, right? And that would not necessarily be bad for four of us to voluntarily, as single dudes, just to do that, to take care of one another, right? And there are some monastic orders traditionally that live sort of like that, right? There are other ones, though, these are the ones Luther really hated, the cloistered monasteries. They literally would wall themselves off from their communities and the world around them to devote themselves to prayer. Now, again, there's nothing wrong with being devoted to prayer. We like prayer. We want people to pray. And we want people to go to church regularly. The monks would keep 7 prayer offices every day plus daily mass. That's good. We like church. The problem is they do that and then do not have any interaction with the people around them except for their brother monks or their sister nuns. And so they don't actually serve the neighbors that God put around them. Many of these monasteries were next to towns, either by design or because a town would arise there. Many of them in the medieval world especially became major economic powerhouses. They had resources, they had land, they'd produce things, and so little villages would pop up. But the monks, the cloistered monasteries wouldn't have anything to do with them. So to wrap all of this up, the way that we kind of, the thing to avoid if you're going to have something like a monastery is the idea that you become spiritually purer by not interacting with regular everyday people because their nasty sins will rub off on you or something. And this is not just a Catholic thing or an Eastern Orthodox thing. This is also something we see in Protestantism, specifically with something like the Anabaptists. Up here in North Dakota, we got a lot of Hutterites, like the followers of Jakob Hutter, and they literally went off and built their own communities to avoid dealing with the English, that's us, who are too sinful to hang out with them. And then, the other permutations of this, you got the Amish, you got the Mennonites. Some Mennonites don't do this, some do. But anyways, the point is there's this tendency in Christianity, a hatred of sin that sometimes gets inadvertently, or I should say inappropriately expressed by trying to avoid people who identify outwardly or can be identified outwardly as sinners, and in a way that the people inside of the Christian community in particular are not.
That's great stuff. So this kind of leads us to the modern day monasteries, and I wrote about this a while back in the Will the Real Church Please Stand Up? And it's basically this phenomenon that I've seen, at least within American evangelicalism, that you have churches. Really, you see in the architecture of the churches where once upon a time you would have a church, you would have basically a small narthex and then the sanctuary, and then maybe if you're lucky, you had a basement. But for the most part, you arrived and you attended the church, and then you went home. Now, if you look at churches, and you'll see this throughout the architecture of churches in America, many of them have, a small sanctuary, then have a humongous fellowship hall, then they have what's called fireside rooms, and then they have huge youth rooms, then they have basketball courts, and they have all sorts of different aspects to these churches. And so if you actually do an aerial shot of that church, you'll see, the sanctuary is maybe, 1/8 the size of the rest of the complex. And so then what ends up happening is you have 7 days a week, you end up having all of these activities at the church that draws you into the church. Now, on the one side, we want to be very, very kind about that. That's great that they want to spend time together. But then what I've also found, which is interesting, I'm pulling from my time in California, is that you had churches that were designed this way, and you look at their bulletins and their scheduled events for the week. Every single night of the week, they would have some sort of event at the church, and the same breath in the same service, the pastor would be in the pulpit telling them they got to get out, they got to go out and do missions. And so I always found it very, very ironic that on the one hand, you're keeping them in the church and almost like a modern day monastery, but then at the same time, then you're barking at them to get out of the church. And so you have a little bit of a conflict there going, what we call, that real fun word, cognitive dissonance. You have two things. The architecture says one thing, and then the pulpit says another. Let's reflect on that. Any thoughts on that? As have you guys encountered that that aspect of church architecture and how it's designed and so forth? Again, we want to be very compassionate and sympathetic to wanting to be together. We don't want to, condemn that, big time. But at the same time, it does create problems.
I think it necessarily it must stem from the theology on. I'd go back to the theology on baptism and the Lord's Supper. Those things being gifts and the divine service being gift, and right theology of why we need those gifts, why we need the forgiveness of sins delivered in the Lord's Supper. It's if you don't have a sacrament, the sacraments that Christ instituted himself, you create other sacraments, and those sacraments might be one's right living or one's involvement in the church, one's the time spent at the church, the amount of devotion you show, or the good works that the good works you do inside the church. And that's where good works are accomplished, is inside the church.
And that's, I think, the other piece, if we want to think about monasticism, ancient, medieval, or contemporary, is besides the impulse to be away from sin, there's also this idea that if something gets branded as a church thing, it's inherently more sanctified than something that's not in the church.
The things done in the church are pleasing to God.
Right. So if I can, pray a whole bunch and I do stuff at the church, that's better. Like if I have a fellowship thing at the church, that ranks higher in God's eyes than if I, invite a couple people to my house and we play cards and eat hot dogs, And that's an impulse I think we need to get away from. And this is one of those things that Luther talks about, at the time of the Reformation, that the everyday stuff that we do as Christians is the place where good works are done. It doesn't have to be, draped in crosses and done inside the sanctuary to count as a good work or to be something that's good and pleasing to God, which is why we Lutherans are kind of nervous about people becoming sectarian and going off and building compounds and doing their own thing, because it's a great way to avoid actually interacting with your neighbor who God put in your life to, serve and to be loved by you.
So, okay, but expound on that for a second there, Brennemar. You said that as far as coming to the church for a quote unquote fellowship event, that is being perceived, if it's inside the four walls of the church, that it's somehow superior than to fellowship at a house or fellowship at a restaurant?
What I mean is there's a temptation to do that. I'm not saying that always happens. We have, I don't know about you guys, we have Advent services and we have a supper beforehand, usually soup or something. And people who show up and eat soup, that's great. But there's nothing more sacred about eating soup at the church than eating soup and with friends at your kitchen table, whether they are members of the church or not. And serving people soup is a fine thing to do. I'm not saying it's not. But I think we need to just disabuse ourselves of the notion that if I do it in the church, that it's somehow more holy, more sacred, more God-pleasing. It's fine to do it in the church. It's great to have fellowship, but it's not automatically better just because it's inside the four walls of a building that's dedicated for religious purposes.
I have the impression that in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, we probably err on the side of not enough fellowship, not enough life together as a congregation, as opposed to too much life together as a congregation.
I think you're right, Neuendorf. I think it's because we're reacting to what we see. Well, as with so many things, we Lutherans react to what everyone else is doing. So we see other people going too far toward doing everything in the church, so we go in the opposite direction and do nothing in the church.
Well, I mean, and I would say that one thing here at St. Paul's, we have a fellowship hall. It's actually right around the door here. And I've told people when they come into membership that this fellowship hall is obviously for us for eating food together and our Bible studies and so forth. And just the other day, we had it's a birthday party, and some of the members, they wanted to have a bunch of families, so they called the church office and they met in there. They had a big birthday party, and came around, and I was getting done with some things, and I sang happy birthday and I left. And God be praised, that was wonderful. The facility could be used that way. So again, we want to make sure what we're saying here, that the fellowship on two sides of the coin. Number one, that the events at the church are not holier than other events outside the fellowship hall, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that we can't do the events in the fellowship hall. That's what it's there for, to be used for members to do things together as family. God be praised, right?
I think when we can begin to err is when we would not just to say that the things that are done in the fellowship hall are more or less holy or more better or are better or lesser, more good works, but it's when the people who show up at the fellowship hall in any denomination consider themselves holier compared to those who are not showing up for those same events. We do a very good job of measuring ourselves against each other. And the ones we can see there, we might think of as somehow holier or somehow just ladder climbing, comparing ourselves to those who aren't necessarily there. Maybe they're at home wiping their kid's butt. I mean, which is in vocation of mother, that's a wonderful work of God, you know. But if that person's too busy to come to the soup supper, but makes it to the divine service, we wonder if it's good enough to just be a pew sitter.
Well, that's something that has happened over the last 20 years, as far as how do we, I hate using the word measure, but how do we understand or measure the health of a church? Is it the bustling activity throughout the middle of the week? No, that can definitely be a good sign. I mean, if the church is definitely, the doors are open and people are coming and going, or do we measure how many people are at that rail receiving the Lord's Supper? How many are hearing the Word of God? And so again, I think what makes you quote unquote plugged into a church is, are you receiving, like Mary, receiving that word and that sacrament? And so our metric for the health of the church, I think really has to be, first and foremost, primarily that word and sacrament. And then everything else is secondary. Now, again, we don't want to say that everything else is evil by any means, but it is definitely truly secondary. Any thoughts on that, reflections, guys?
I think the reason you bring up this idea of kind of a parallel life for Christians in a really busy church is not just because you're scared that people will measure their sanctification according to how busy they are in the church, but that it can get so consuming that you really have in effect left the world. So a big theme of ancient monasticism was forsaking the world, leaving the world, and that included your parents. That included your church. So you would, if you were a Christian living in ancient Rome for the first 3 centuries, there was a not insignificant chance that you would be martyred. You would shed your blood for your faith in Christ. But with the legalization of Christianity under the Emperor Constantine, and then its institution as the official religion of the Roman Empire soon thereafter, the possibility of martyrdom faded into the background. And so really devout Christians thought, oh man, I can't die for my faith anymore, but I can die virtually by dying to the world and leaving my family, leaving my church, leaving my community, and going to live in the wilderness with these other hyper spiritual Christians. And monks would actually view it as a grave temptation from the devil to leave the monastery and go back to your parents. And if that's not substituting human laws for divine, I don't know what is. So the primary problem is cutting yourself off from those relationships that God has given you by nature. And I mean, if your Christian faith is leading you to cut off your parents, whom you are commanded to honor, that's not the Christian faith as Jesus taught it. And if your church is conducting its affairs in such a way that you are cut off from relationships outside the church, well, how could St. Paul be including you in the description of, then you'd have to go out of the world? Paul did not intend that we should go out of the world. Jesus did not intend that we should go out of the world. Jesus intended that we should be salt and light. But the way we do that is by actually living and working in the world, being visibly members of our community, and having real relationships with people outside of the church. Thereby, the gospel works through us, and we draw people into fellowship with Jesus. So I think it can be fine to have a very active social life in your church, as long as you don't elevate it and say, this makes me a hyper spiritual Christian, or it gets to the point that it's cutting you off from your wider community.
I think that we see kind of a particularly Lutheran-y North Dakota version of that, which is the the pastor or the board chair or whatever shames you if you don't want to show up and do something that you're asked to do. I don't much care for that, because if you don't have time to be on the evangelism board or bring a plate of bars, like, you're not inherently a bad Christian for not being able to do that. You might just be busy. And so I don't like it when we trade in shame on these kinds of things. I think that's incredibly inappropriate because, like you said, we have natural obligations to other things besides the church. And so long as we're receiving from Christ, we don't need to necessarily have to bring a pan of bars to church or whatever.
Yeah, very well put. So let's talk about, as far as with the time remaining here, relating to the world, this idea of vocation, how our vocations place us right into the midst of the world. When we say the vocation, what do we mean by vocation, and what are some examples of vocation?
So you have vocations as a result of your natural relationships. So you have the vocation of child to your parents, of sibling to your siblings, of parent to your children, and of spouse to your spouse, and all the things that extend from that. And then God has also given us all natural aptitudes through which He has equipped us to serve our neighbors. And those put us into natural vocations, divine callings through which we care for others.
So are you saying that if I am good at something, I have a talent for something, and I keep that to myself and don't in fact use that to benefit my
Bury it.
neighbor, that I'm doing a bad thing?
Yeah.
Oh no. It's a good thing I'm not good at anything. Bo, are you good at anything?
This, I've been. My wife bought the Simply Piano app, so I'm learning how to play piano. So maybe I'll play. Maybe I'll be an organist at the.
You can be our new organist, Bo.
Yeah.
Bo's
Yeah.
good at bow hunting. He's got
Yeah.
bows right in the background there.
Yeah, I'm not good at that. That's something I.
You are
aspire
good
to.
at that.
I aspire to that.
You have shot and killed deer with your bows.
I have done that. Yes.
I couldn't do that.
Mm-hmm.
You could learn, though.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe. So we all have our natural aptitudes, which we cultivate and deploy in the service of our neighbors. And if, in the pursuit of those vocations naturally given to us by God, we encounter others and yet keep ourselves from sin, or maintain the struggle against our own sin, then there will be plenty of opportunities to draw others from the world to the church.
Yeah, so the vocations themselves are venues, per se, venues where we interact with the world, as basically as plumbers and farmers and even pastors, and in our vocations, just interacting again. And these are where the good works really take place, the good works that God has prepared in advance for us to walk in, as we simply serve our neighbor in those capacities, being, as you mentioned earlier, Neundorf salt and light in this world. And
That's something that I think that's important to hit on. So I've been a pastor in Oaks now for going on 8 years. It'll be 8 years next summer. And I've been here long enough that random people in town are coming up to me and asking me about church stuff and religion stuff. And this is one of the delights about being a small town pastor for a long period of time, is you get to be known as a pastor. And once people kind of get used to the idea that you're the guy there, people will start come talking to you. It's just a matter of you have to go to the hardware store and the gas station and the cafe once in a while. So you get to know people and they get to know you. But, my point being that if you just sit in your church all day, every day, this stuff doesn't happen. And I'm not saying you have to invent reasons to go out, just like, go live your life and
But
go to the
pastor,
local stores.
so you're saying pastors aren't supposed to wall themselves off in their offices and study Hebrew to the extent where they aren't serving their flock and getting out into the community as well.
Well, I think they need to wall themselves off and study Hebrew, but I
Mm-hmm.
also think they need to, actually shepherd the sheep that Christ put
Mm-hmm.
into their care.
Oh, and then the things you described, going to the hardware store and the gas station, are not necessarily part of the job description of caring for the flock, but they are part of your vocation as just living in the world.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
That's my point.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Because I'm going to go to the auto parts store later and get car parts, and I'm going to have
Yeah.
a nice chat with whatever guys at the counter. That's what you do.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Well, even in the pastoral vocation, going to the hospital to visit, one of your members, you interact with the nurses and the doctors and all the custodians and the people at the front desk, and that happens naturally. And God be praised. That's an opportunity to enter per se into the world and to be in the midst of the world in your vocation as pastor, and that happens for laity as well as they're engaged in. Whether it's going to the grocery store, going to the hardware store, or even during Thanksgiving, going to their relative's house, you're engaging, and those are opportunities to be salt and light.
So
Yeah.
I'm going to beat one of my hobby horses to death here. When these conversations come up with you, because people know you go to church and are a Christian and whatever vocation you have, and they ask you this stuff, this is a natural time to invite them to come to church. Because I can't even tell you how many times I've had somebody stop by my study and say, "Hey, pastor, talk to this guy out doing my job, and this is the conversation we had." And I said, "That's great. Did you invite them to church?" "Oh man, I wish I would have thought of that." Just do it. That's all I'm saying. Just do it.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Anything else to summarize what we've talked about? We've talked about the church theologically, preserving that theology and knowing who we are in Christ. We talked about the problem of being monastic and the downfalls of that. But then we also talked about our vocations going into the world via our vocations being salt and light. Do we summarize it best, or any little nuances that we need to tidy up before we put a big bow on this episode?
What's the deal with the haircut? What's the deal with the haircut? That's everybody's question since we started this.
The monastic haircut, huh?
Yeah. What's the deal with that?
Western monks, as in Latin-speaking Western Europe, would shave the center of their heads in what is called the tonsure, and that was intended to make you ugly, so that you were not sexually attractive.
So the guys who are already inherently ugly didn't have to do it, or what?
Seems it's effective.
It ramped up the ugliness.
Uh-huh.
And it's also a convenient spot to put your yarmulke.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I don't know about that, but Eastern monks don't have to shave the crown of their heads. So
They just grow gnarly beards.
I was told once upon a time that they did their hair that way because it resembled the crown of thorns of Christ.
You're probably right.
I don't know where I heard that, but I like your definition better. It makes them look ugly. Nice.
And one thing that I think, if I remember right, I was talking about when we got cut off the last time. I really think 1 Corinthians 5 is an important chapter for this discussion. And if Christians are living just like the rest of the world, living in the same sins that characterize the rest of the world, those Christians are not going to be sticking out like a sore thumb. They're just going to be blending in.
Right.
But what Paul is admonishing us is that we should, yes, be associating with the folks who live in these sins, but not live in these sins ourselves. And if you are leading a genuinely Christian life, you are going to stick out like a sore thumb among unbelievers. And that can be the God-given opportunity to bear witness to what Jesus has done for you and to draw people to the life of the church.
I think that seems to be becoming more obvious year after year, that if Lutherans would just live like Lutherans, if Christians would just live like Christians, that we
That's a
would
pretty
stick
tall
up.
ask.
Mhm.
Tall ask, Bo.
Tall ask, yeah.
Well, call it wraps here, guys.
Put a bow on it, like you
Put a
said.
bow on it,
put
yeah,
a
before
bow
we
on it.
Before
crash
it
again
crashes
for
again.
the fourth time. We have a lot of editing to do, right?
Not
We need
us.
something to keep you out of trouble, though.
Yeah, we'll
Yeah.
edit tonight and get this out and piece together. So,
Mhm.
all right. Well, we want to thank everyone of you for joining us on Three Padres and a Shepherd. We are in the world, but we're not of the world, but we are for the world in the name of Jesus and also through our good works of service in our vocations. God bless.
It could crash right now, and that wouldn't be a problem.
Think we should crash? Yeah.
Yeah, just as well crash now.
Neuendorf would appreciate this song being cut short.
If that song were cut short, or not cut short, the podcast could not be saved.